Russia-Ukraine war, and definitely we'll talk about it in regards to Hungary and regards to the Central European region. So our guest today for this panel is John O'Sullivan, the president of Danube Institute, Attila Demko, the head of the Center of Geopolitics of Matthias Corvinus Collegium, and myself, I'm the moderator on the panel. I'm a director of research at Danube Institute. So, my first question goes after the previous panel, which our guests were discussing the elections in Hungary. Hungary was criticized a lot in the last few months because of somehow different approach to Ukraine and to the war in Ukraine. But was this approach so different than it was for other countries? How could you conclude what was the Hungarian approach to the war and why it was different, if we could call it different? Would like to start, Attila.
So I would say that 90% of the time it wasn't different. So the Prime Minister, the President, the Parliament all said immediately that this is a naked aggression against a sovereign country. Hungary recognizes the full sovereignty of Ukraine on the full territory. We cannot accept even Crimea. We said it from 2014. And this naked aggression was very openly and forcefully condemned by all political leaders, including the president and the prime minister. So I don't think in that there can be any debate or doubt. Also, I think in the case of refugee policy, Hungary opened its borders immediately to a very large number of refugees. I can say that now it's a bigger number than the number of the refugees, or at that case they were more like migrants who came in 2015. Now we see what a refugee wave is, because these are women and children and elderly, not young men like in 2015. So there is a difference, and there was a different approach. I think everybody moved to help in the country, including the government, which made immediately special rules to have the refugees free travel within Hungary, and it's really easy now to get, or if you are a Ukrainian, to get a job, to settle, and also to get support. So we try to give schooling also to the children. So in that sense, I think it was a very swift and very comprehensive response. And also the sanctions issue, which come up from time to time. For example, on the SWIFT sanctions, the sanctions on the banking system, there was fake news that Hungary was against it. No, Hungary was for it at the first round of sanctions. It was just 1 or 2 days after the start of the Russian invasion, which is ongoing for 8 years, by the way. So it's just a new round and a extremely brutal round of Russian aggression against Ukraine. So it was very clear for us that those sanctions which hurt Russia more than hurt Europe or hurt us are good sanctions. Actually, we supported until now 5 package of sanctions. This is the 6th package. This is a bit more problematic, and I think this is one of the reasons of criticism. But this is about oil. And Hungary, at least since the First World War, we are an landlocked country. We cannot do and cannot trade with whoever we want, unlike the United Kingdom. And we are connected with a pipeline system through Ukraine, by the way. So the oil we are receiving today from Russia is coming through Ukraine, and it gives a bit of security to the Ukrainian oil and gas system, by the way. We always forget that when Russia is selling oil and gas to Hungary and some other countries, especially oil, because gas is mostly coming through the south route, but also gas is coming through Ukraine today, it gives a bit of safety to the Ukrainian system. But anyway, with gas, with this number 6 round of sanctions or with oil, we couldn't be that flexible, and we were under quite a lot of pressure. But we have to see the realities. So the Hungarian government policy is based on realities and not on wishes. And the reality is that we cannot, we simply cannot replace Russian oil easily, at least, because we have only one other route, or one other major route is from the Adriatic Sea, from Croatia, and there are limits from how much we can take there, and there are different types of oil, and the Hungarian oil refinery, there is one big one, and there is another one in the hand of MOL, which is in Slovakia. MOL is the Hungarian oil company, are made to take a Russian type of oil, Ural type of oil, so you cannot switch it like in a month or two. So again, it's rational. And I don't want to talk too much. The last issue, and I think it got a lot of attention, is the issue of weapons deliveries. That's why Hungary wasn't delivering weapons and not allowing its territory to deliver weapons to Ukraine. Actually, this is not fully true. So Hungary contributed to the European Common Fund, which bought weapons for Ukraine. So actually, as a Hungarian taxpayer, I'm financing, and all Hungarian taxpayers in this room are financing weapons to Ukraine. So Hungary is giving weapons to Ukraine, but not directly. And the other issue is transfer. There is a Hungarian community because of the border changes in the First and Second World Wars, after in what is Subcarpathia Oblast today of Ukraine. And we have a concern, and unfortunately today we had an attack on the railway system in Subcarpathia. So it was a concern, it's a real concern that if Hungarian territory is used, the first thing the Russian will try to do is to strike Hungarian inhabited cities within Ukraine. And you may say that Poland has a minority also in Ukraine. Actually, a Hungarian minority is concentrated into a very narrow strip of land just next to the border. So anywhere you cross the border, you will find Hungarian towns and villages in Ukraine on the other side. So it's a totally different situation, the Polish minority, because the Soviet Union basically ethnically cleansed Western Ukraine, former Eastern Poland, from Poles. They are dispersed, they are not the same. So actually it's a very problematic issue. And one final thought, that we also have to make a big mental change, because we had a lot of conflicts in the last 8 years with Ukraine. And even for me, seeing this naked aggression, I have been to most of the places, including the theater of Mariupol, which are totally destroyed. And so I feel the emotional pain of seeing what's happening, but still, I still remember the last 8 years when friends were basically lives. Okay, it's a long story. I don't want to talk too much, but it was a touchy relationship with Ukraine, with Hungary in the last 8 years. So that's a bit of a reason too that we are a bit of different. But 90%, I think, is the same policy. So what we read in the British press, that ally of Putin, actually, again, we are financing weapons. And I forgot that Hungarian, at least they are based in Hungary, this 12-nation heavy airlifting is being used for such deliveries. So actually it's happening from a Hungarian airport. It's not well known, maybe it's not to be advertised too much, but it's still a fact.
Thank you, Attila. You also partly answered some other questions as well, but John, if you could also comment.
Thank you. Can you hear? Yes, good, thank you. Well, first of all, before I discuss Hungary's response to this crisis, I think I probably, just to avoid misunderstanding, say what I think, which is to say, as a national conservative, and indeed with touches of a Gladstonian liberal, I think that the moral issue in Ukraine is absolutely clear. Ukraine is not a small country fighting rightly to be free, as Gladstone might have said. It's a large country. It's the second largest country in Europe, and it's got 42 million people living in it. It is a legal existence. It's an independent state. It does have a mixed population, particularly in the east, but nonetheless, the action of the Russian government in invading it is a monstrous act of unprovoked aggression. Yes, there are all kinds of reasons why people do things, there always are. But the fact is, this breaks every possible rule, and in addition to breaking every rule, some of the arguments used to justify it by Mr. Putin personally in major lectures are, in the lingo of political theory, they are fascistic to a remarkable degree. He is proposing to deny the right of Ukrainians to be Ukrainians, to force them to accept an identity they reject. Maybe it was an identity they once had in a different time and circumstance, but nonetheless, he's done that. He's threatening to, in a sense, make them be someone else in a place which is not the place they cannot call home. He's deporting people in the way that Stalin did in large numbers. He's forcing them to speak another language, and so on. These are terrible crimes. And if possible, which I don't think will prove to be the case, he should be held to account for it personally, as well as the Russian state. Now, that said, what does it mean? Well, it means in the spectrum, in the Visegrad countries, of attitudes towards the war, you have Poland at one extreme, you have Hungary at the others, and you have the Czech Republic and Slovakia along that spectrum between the two. I personally would advocate a policy closer, well, actually it would be the policy of Poland and indeed of the British government, rather than the one that is being pursued. That's what I would advocate as a private citizen. Now, the reasons for this are, of course, the nature of the aggression and its injustice. And the second one is that when Mr. Putin, in a sense, began, not in 2008, but last December, making clear his intention to take these actions, he justified his measures. He justified the war in the most explicit terms of reversing the result of the Cold War, in the end of the Cold War. So he, in essence, is arguing for not simply his right to take over Ukraine. He's also insisting on the necessity of NATO retreating from its present boundaries, including, of course, Hungary. These things have got to be completely rejected and opposed. Now, that's my personal feeling in the matter, and what I would advocate as a private citizen. However, if I'm a believer in nation states, I have to accept that their interests sometimes differ, and that if I think they're entitled to follow those interests, I must examine whether or not their attitudes, by and large, follow those interests. When we look through that lens at the situation, or rather at Hungary's policy, what do we see? Well, first of all, just to pick up from the last session, there is absolutely no doubt that in pursuing its current policy, the Hungarian government is representing the will and wishes of the Hungarian people. I don't just say that from the standpoint of the election result, but friends of mine who were covering it described to me, and I mean foreign correspondents, described to me in very clear terms. One friend who had come directly from Poland to Hungary said, well, you go from talking to the Polish man in the street to the Hungarian man in the street, you just get two completely different attitudes to the war. The Poles say they cheer any American soldiers they see who are in Poland to help, and they are, and this is extremely, and the whole atmosphere of we should do more, not less. In fact, obviously many Poles would like directly to intervene. When you come to Hungary, you have people who express the point of view that, look, this is an area, this is a country, this is a region over which armies have gone back and forth, sometimes riding horses, sometimes in tanks, for generations. We are worried about any conflict. We are worried that any conflict, if it is not brought to a halt soon, will spread, as indeed conflicts tend to, because the conflict engenders hatreds, which then are the basis for further attacks. So, and I think this goes to every level of Hungarian society, there is acute anxiety about the potential consequences of the war and its continuance. The second is, I think, the account you give of the needs of Hungary to continue to receive Russian oil is quite accurate, and is indeed a perfectly good reason why Hungary should be cautious in accepting sanctions. At every stage, it seems to me, the Hungarians have said two things. One, they condemn the action of, they are members of NATO, loyal members, they condemn the action, and you don't hear those remarks quoted all that often, but they are clearly there on the record. And then the other side of it is, we can't afford to simply cut off our access to Russian oil. It would destroy our situation here. And then I think, as regards Mr. Orban, in this old soccer phrase, playing interference for Russia, I think it's clear if he's playing interference for anybody, he's playing it for Germany. In fact, the position of Hungary on sanctions and oil has been plain from the beginning, is the same position as Germany, also, by the way, of Italy and other major powers. The difference is that Orban says plainly that's what he's doing, whereas we've seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks, the German Chancellor is not very easily given to making straightforward statements which then are acted upon. In fact, most statements seem to be like what they call it chaff that you send up to prevent a missile coming in to distract it. That's the way I would read most of Chancellor Scholz's statements. I could go on this way, but my fundamental argument is I hope that the one serious criticism, well, not the one, but the most needless thing which I think has happened, which is a mistake, is I wish that Mr. Orban said of him, you know, he could pick a fight in an empty room. I wish he had actually used somewhat softer rhetoric towards Mr. Zelensky. It's true he was the recipient of an attack from him, but look, Zelensky is fighting for his life and fighting for his country's life, so I think on this occasion the softer tone should have been the response, because the policy is not unreasonable. And finally, I will say that if Hungary is the only country that doesn't want to impose sanctions on Russian energy, that will only last for a day or two. In other words, the Hungarians will in the end go along with the majority or the totality of the EU. In resisting that for the moment, they are pursuing an obvious national interest. And I think on the larger issue, the Hungarian attitude towards Russia, this is my final point, have a look at what Viktor Orban said in his post-election press conference. It's very interesting. It's suggestive rather than pure declaration, but he analyzed Hungarian policy in relation to Russia as having undergone a change in 2008, following the failure of the West to resist Putin on the Russo-Georgian war. They followed up that failure in failing to resist Putin in Crimea, Luhansk and Donbass. And now he says the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, A, and B, the very surprising rallying of NATO. Admittedly, there are cracks in that NATO, but nobody doubts that NATO and all its members have responded much more strongly and aggressively even, and much more persuasively than they have done at any point since 2008 to resist Russia. And that is going to be, I think that is going to be the factor which will bring Hungary along with the rest. At the moment, Hungary's position is perfectly defensible in national interest terms. But I think in both strategic and moral terms, Hungary will want to estimate how it will want to determine how it wants its policies to look in the long run, and I think that will dictate a shift in policy, which I think is probably coming.
Thank you very much, John. Well, I would like to expand one of your arguments regarding the Hungarian public opinion. I think that's an important point for the public also to understand. And let's combine this question, so the question of why Hungarian public opinion on the war in Ukraine is somewhat different than public opinion in Poland or Romania or Slovakia. And let's combine this question with another one, just because we are short of time, and I try to ask more questions regarding Russian influence and Russian information warfare in our region and also in Ukraine, maybe also in Zakarpattia. So if you could address these questions, please.
Yes, Russian information war is a very important question, especially when we look at Hungarian-Ukrainian relations. The relations were not good because of language and education issues. And I think here in this country you can see how these issues, like in Northern Ireland, how touchy these issues are. We are not there with Ukraine, we were never there. I'm just saying that these are very touchy and emotional issues. What Russia did on these issues is to exploit the existing conflict. They did it both in Hungary, and actually we didn't really look into this we were not following this really well for a while, how they penetrate Facebook groups, how they penetrate thinking of people, but they did it, I think, quite well. I checked some Facebook groups lately, and actually some of their videos and some of their stuff is really professional, sometimes even funny, and many times, and almost always lying, of course. Not always, because good propaganda always had a bit of truth in it. So they used to portray Ukraine as a terrible country in these, especially Hungarian right and the nationalistic circles. And Ukrainian laws and some of the cases against Hungarian minority leaders, actually, again, facts, are helped Russians to sell this propaganda. And again, on the Ukrainian side, what they did, they actually had one or two kinetic actions against the Hungarian minority. Now it's very clear that they blew up in 2018 or firebombed the Hungarian Cultural Association Center in Ungvary, in Uzhgorod, in Ukraine. That's a town with a Hungarian minority. So actually they wanted to show that it was done by the Ukrainian nationalists. And there were other actions that they put newspaper articles into Ukrainian press that depicted Hungary as wants to take this western province of Ukraine, which was part of Hungary before Second and First World War. So they played both countries and both public opinions, and most of these operations cost very little. So actually, a newspaper article in Ukraine, as a Ukrainian journalist told me, they can be bought for £200-300 pounds, and nobody will check if it's true or not. So the Russians played on this, and definitely in both countries' public opinions it had an impact, as well as the reality of let's say the how we see things, history, because we do have a debate on how we see the region's history and each other's history. So yes, that's one issue. And Hungarian public opinion, may I add to what John said, that for Poles and Baltics, the Russians were the oppressors for centuries. In Hungary, the Russians were short-time visitors. The short times were usually very terrible, and okay, we had the 40 years of Soviet occupation, but they were not Russians in a national sense. we were left alone. Unlike Poles for more than 100 years, or the Baltics, they were really truly treated very terrible. Why Hungarians were not, we were left alone. I was one of the biggest resistors of Russian language. 6 years, and I learned very little, and that was the Hungarian sport of not learning Russian. Anybody who is above age 40 or 45 maybe, I learned 6 years really, and I know nothing. And it was like, and that's another reason that Hungarians don't understand Russia as well as many other countries, especially the Baltics and the Poles, and even the Czechs, because we just don't speak Russian, we don't understand Russia. And it's easier to sell an agenda in Hungary. It's harder in one way because we don't speak Russian, but in a way it's easier because we don't know Russia. And that's a reason why Hungarian public opinion is different. But I would say the main point is the conflict with Ukraine, which we had in the last. Ukraine was our best neighbor before 2014, because Ukrainians treated the Hungarian community and Hungarian historical sites the best from all neighbors. So it was really from the best. There was a big change, and it shocked Hungarian society. There were also, okay, it's a long story. To cut it short, Hungary is different because we have a different history. We are not a Slavic country, we are not a Slavic nation. Our culture is very different from all the cultures around. So we are a bit different by default of being a different culture, totally. I mean, Hungarian language has zero mutual understanding with any of the neighboring nations. Why from Polish or from Ukrainian you can understand Russian quite well. So that's a big difference. And is there anything else?
No. I think that's enough.
We should say, by the way, that the difference between the Hungarian government and the Polish government and with the other two countries in the Visegrad countries in between is not quite, the difference between governments is not fully reflected in the differences in public opinion. There is actually more support for the Hungarian government's position, namely that of policy of prudence and peace. We heard stability and peace before, but from the standpoint of the person making policy, and this, I think, people making Hungarian policy, well, we have the ambassador here, he can tell us, would feel it's based on prudence and the national interest and the desire to end the war as quickly as that actually has more purchase on the public opinion in the Czech Republic and in Slovakia than the governments reflect, and I think we should acknowledge that really. Now, as regards the different attitudes of the Hungarians, it's very interesting this, and you've given a very interesting picture. Now, I want to look at two other things. The first is that the Russian government is making claims upon Hungary as well as upon Poland and the other countries, and namely that their foreign policy has to take account of Russian interests. They're not fully free to do it. That's at least is the implication of his letter sent to NATO and Washington on December the 9th, I think. And that has, in my view, should not have any weight with Poland, despite them, and you've explained exactly why it doesn't have. But in the case of Hungary, Hungary was not a member, was not occupied for long periods by the Russian Empire. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that's a very, very different situation. Now, the other is a more interesting one. There is an element in Hungarian public opinion and in conservative opinion which is skeptical of, or even sometimes hostile to the West. Now, this has long roots. The Hungarians have regarded themselves, as the Serbs too to an extent, as the defenders of the West against attacks from the East. But not just the defenders, but the defenders towards whom the West is always ungrateful. Obviously 1956 plays into that, but earlier episodes too. I once was addressing a meeting of young conservative businessmen in Hungary, in Budapest, and somebody asked me, recited a litany of complaints about the West, and then proposed an anti-Western policy. And I responded by saying, what is it you do for a living? And he said, oh, I advise people on investments. And I said, tell me, do you give any advice, financial advice to your clients on the basis of the arguments you've just been giving me? And he said, no. Well, of course, he would have opened himself to legal problems then. But so there is, therefore, in Hungarian politics, this surprising criticism of the West, of which, however, Hungary very much wants to continue to be a part. And it is undoubtedly a loyal member in terms of keeping all the rules of NATO in the EU. So you can see how misunderstandings arise, and you can see why the policies at the moment of the Hungarian government come under criticism. My own view is that I would like those policies to change in response, as I say, to the strategic interest of us all, which is to reduce the threat that Russia poses to the whole of Europe as a power which has never given up its neo-imperial mindset. That's one. And the other, of course, is to try to keep the international rules. What a final concession to Hungarian policy here. After the Russian occupation, partial occupation of Georgia, 23 Central European political and intellectual leaders wrote a letter to the newly elected President Obama. President Obama, they said, we are relying on, we've just seen the most gratuitous rejection of the rules of international conduct we have all accepted since 1989. We would like from you a commitment to this region, which has your strongest, who are your strongest allies in Europe. And what they got was a visit from Vice President Biden, and no really effective statement of policy that would suggested that they would come to the defense of these countries, or rather give them really solid support. That was a huge disappointment, and that's one of the reasons why, all of these countries, but Hungary, I think here in this case particular, all of these countries are somewhat, until NATO responded as strongly as it has done, all of these countries were nervous that when the Russians started to move, maybe the West wouldn't do much. That fear explains a lot of the policies that Central Europe has been flirting with. It also, I think, explains why that attitude, at least, is now beginning to disappear as the reality of the Russian threat becomes clearer.
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to go on with my questions, but I see some kind of pressure coming from the lady with the microphone. So yes, let's collect maybe 2 or 3 questions, and please introduce yourself. Go on with the question, and yes, and then our expert will answer that. Maybe the lady here.
It's on. Hello, thank you. Sophie Scruton. Could one of the speakers please say a little bit more about the relationship between other countries in Central Europe who have a shared friendship usually? I hear, so I'm thinking of Poland and the Czech Republic perhaps. What will be done to try and keep that friendship strong at this point in time? I mean, the speakers have also said today that they didn't suffer as badly from the communist occupation of Hungary as those other 2 countries, and I feel that if that bond is being lost, where are the grounds for friendship going forward from now? Thank you.
Okay, maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and there were 2 gentlemen in the first 2 rows.
Philip Blond, Res Publica. I'm also a professor in Budapest. for those of us who love Hungary, and I am one, we find the desperate position to find a centre between Russia and Ukraine to be very, very depressing. If I think Hungary is a leader in the West on domestic policy, on economic policy. I think it's reinventing the third way, particularly in how it distributes and includes people. I think it's an amazing success story. But Hungary has a history of choosing the wrong allies, you know, and disastrously so. And I'm not saying Russia's an ally, but you take the point. And I think that everything is imperiled for those of us who support Hungary by this disastrous attempt to chart a middle ground. And that Schulz is quite rightly subject to all the criticism. Austria, which is viewed as highly penetrated by Russian intelligence and Russian interests, is similarly inveighed against. And so the criticisms of Hungary are not partisan, they're genuine. And they're simply this, that if you are to be a leader of the West, and if you are to participate in collective Western structures and change them for the better, all of which I support, you simply can't have your cake and eat it. This is an existential question for the West. And for those of us who support Hungary, the present position regarding Russia is a scandal. And whilst I think John's done an excellent point of distinguishing himself and a position, this defence of a prudent position is not sustainable with being a leader of the West, and it's the limits of a national conservative take. Self-interest is not defensible within the context of advancing the West. So what, you know, and it's imperiled relations with Poland and the V4. So what I guess my question is, if you forgive the prior reflections, is what would it take? How much would the cost have to rise to Hungary to get it to shift in the direction that John wants, and of course, obviously, I want?
Thank you. Maybe one more question from Jim.
Andrew Tattenborn, writer and academic. It actually reflects very much what Miss Goodman said. The left-wing press in Britain trumpeted the fact that Visegrad was dead almost as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine. I rather doubted that, and I'm just wondering whether my doubts might be confirmed.
Thank you. We have two similar questions regarding basically the Visegrad cooperation and between relationship between Poland, Hungary, and Czech
Well,
Republic.
first, I'm going to probably answer two. I think we had three questions, but the two. As relation, first of all, to Visegrad cooperation, the idea that Visegrad cooperation is dead is nonsense. I mean, there are diplomatic difficulties between three other members of Visegrad and Hungary. But I, for example, just had a conference on energy in Budapest, and on the platform we had a vigorous debate between, on the one hand, which one of the participants, I've asked my colleagues to take that particular sort of 15 minutes and put it out separately. That debate was between a distinguished Hungarian public figure, your predecessor János Csák, and who was the head of a major oil company, for the biggest one in Hungary, and on the one hand, and the former defense minister of the Czech Republic is now a member of the European Parliament, who represented the so to speak, the other Central European point of view. There was a vigorous debate, it's well worth watching, but at the end, they concluded that this would not prevent the Visegrad acting in cooperation with each other over the long from now on, in effect, because the common interest was sufficiently strong, and that they were going to be using that cooperation not simply vis-a-vis Russia, but more on an everyday basis, more with the EU. So that's the first point. Secondly, as regards the Central European countries, I think they have a tremendous amount in common, which is at every level the basis of this cooperation. What about another country which occupies an important place in Central Europe? That is the country, Germany, which we really have got to ask questions about, because the Germans have got this extraordinary ability to, like quick change artists on the stage, to become completely different people. Until 1870, they were Ruritanians. Between 1870 and 1919, they were Prussians. Between 1919 and 1933, they were decadents. Between 1933 and 1945, they were Nazis. Between 1945 and 1968, they were Americans. Between 1968 and 1989, they were good Europeans. And we've really been wondering ever since where they were going to end up next, what national uniform they were going to put on. And mostly, we haven't been concerned about them putting on jackboots, but about them waving too many peace signs, and in a sense neglecting and relying on everyone else to protect their security, while they made a lot of money. Now, you know, these are all, every single one of these changes can be understood in the light of the interests of the day. But we still, they still send a kind of mysterious message to us, whereas the Brits, somehow or other, always end up doing what people think the Brits are going to end up doing, and they certainly have done so, I think, in this, in the case of Ukraine. I forget there was another question.
The second question was about how much damage or what could happen to Hungary so that it could change its position from the middle, basically, to more active position.
Of course, Philip and I are on the same page, but he's reading italics when I'm reading Roman. I think that the differences between Hungary and its allies are real, but they're not deep, and I don't think they will be sustained. And consequently, I'm fairly optimistic, particularly since, in most other respects, the Hungarian government, well, actually, I think, for, Philip, what you said was, yes, the Austrians have reached the same policy conclusions. Yes, the Germans have, and they've been criticized, therefore it's right to criticize Hungary. They haven't been criticized as Hungary has been criticized, have they? They haven't been criticized as these things were not the expression of a hostility to democracy. And so, in other words, I don't, as I hope I've made plain, I'm happy to criticize Hungary, but I don't also think the truth of any criticism, however exaggerated, should be taken as gospel. And that is the situation at the moment in the left-wing media in Europe and Britain.
I mean, Der Spiegel ran a piece asking, have the Russians, bought Schultz? So it's pretty vehement in Germany as well. My point is...
Yeah, the Germans criticizing the Germans is something else.
But that's welcome. But my sense is this, is what are the prices and what are the costs that will be raised to shift? I don't think policy shifts just happen like erosion. They happen because of forces deployed. What do you both imagine would and will be deployed as this conflict gets ever more intense?
I have an answer to that, but maybe, Attila, you want to come in.
Well, as I said at the beginning, Hungarian policy is basically 90% the same as any other NATO and EU members' policy. Shift on weapons deliveries. I saw the polls. 75% of the population is against it. So, it's a. Before the elections, I think it was impossible for that, and now, even now, it would be, quite impossible. The people are against it, the voters. And the other thing is that even if we could, if there would be a change, we couldn't provide much to Ukraine. For one reason, and when anybody talks about the ally of Putin, look at the Hungarian rearmament program, which meant throwing out all of the Soviet tactics. we don't have much Soviet arms left, because we are buying basically German arms. We threw out everything, almost everything. So we are building basically along with Poland, but in terms of, it's a much smaller army, of course, and a smaller country than Poland, the most modern NATO army actually in the whole alliance. We don't have, we have a few remaining T-72 tanks, and basically that's it. And I think these tanks could do more harm to their drivers than to the enemy in the current state. But again, what pressure, you know, look at Hungary in the last 12 years, what pressures we got. There is no pressure which can change policy if there is a vital interest. So, and the vital interest is the working of the economy and the heating of the homes, including the home of basically 70% of the people. You cannot, this is a very left-wing thing, and I'm not talking about you, sir, but we cannot wish away facts. The fact is that not because of Hungary, we tried to reroute, even 15 years ago with the Nabucco pipeline, from only Russian dependency to other, and we talked about the Neptune field, which would be now running if there is not a debate in Bucharest. We tried to reroute, not to diversify for 15 years now, and it didn't happen. Not, I think, not because of Hungary. And now we are at a situation, if there is no Russian gas, there will be at least a total industrial collapse, but also problem if there is a very bad winter, people would freeze. I mean, these are facts of life, and no amount of pressure can change that. And anyway, one thing is always forgotten. If the oil stops coming through Ukraine, if the gas stops coming through Ukraine, what will stop the Russians of completely destroying Ukraine's gas and oil infrastructure? We always forget that. There is on YouTube an interview with the director of Naftogaz, a Ukrainian person, who says that our interest is actually to continue this. So what we should give to Ukraine, what we should do to Ukraine is to close down Nord Stream 1 and buy the stuff through Ukrainian pipelines, because that would ensure the viability of Ukraine's pipeline system. And we are not talking about that. Actually, those Ukrainian experts who are, and it's online, it's a Bloomberg video. Naftogaz is the biggest gas delivery company in Ukraine.
So you're doing it to help Ukraine?
No, I'm not, you know, as I said, this is the interest of Ukraine too. That's my belief.
The trouble is every one of these major countries had said something very similar to you, and all of them have backtracked because other innovative possibilities are made available. So one can understand why people find this relatively unbelievable. You might indeed be correct, in which case I apologise, but one can understand, given how quickly the debate changes and shifts once other possibilities become available. So I just doubt very much that it's a fact in the way in which you describe, because innovation and adaptation changes those facts.
Yeah, I think I can make in my flat on the 9th floor a nice wooden stuff. No, sir, it's absolutely not possible in case of Hungary. In some other countries, yes, you know, but not in the case of Hungary. I'm convinced of that we need years. In oil, we need 2 years to change at least, and a lot of investment. In gas, even more. It's doable in years, but we don't have 2 or 3 years without Russian gas. So that's my honest answer.
Well, my own view is that you can't blame a man for not doing something he can't do. And I think that if the Hungarians can't actually reduce the use of Russian energy more than they're doing or plan to do, there's nothing, we have to accept that. And that's true not just for them, but for all of the countries in Europe too. No country is going to cut itself off from the thing that keeps the energy that keeps it going. Now, Philip, that means that people like you and me, who want the Hungarians to do as we think more, are obliged collectively to come up with some kind of arrangements. And I don't think we would meet any resistance from the government if we were to do that. So that's the first point. When you look at the other things, an awful lot of what people disapprove of in Hungarian policy seems to be rhetorical. It's the language that's used and the impression given, and my view, as I've already said, false, of an affection of being similar to Putin. This is complete nonsense. And you know, when it's put to me, I always say, well, how many journalists have been murdered by the Hungarian government? As far as I know, none. How many journalists have been put in prison by the Hungarian? As far as I know, none. How many newspapers have been closed down? None. And so on and so forth. So we're living in a, when we move from reality, which is messy and problematic, with then to left-wing ideas, we're living in an Eric Ambler thriller, which is, there's no relationship to reality. Now, the last question, look. Every single country in Europe has dramatically changed some of its policies in the last 3 months. Why? Because of two things. The failure of the Russian army and the bravery and expertise and courage, and skill of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are changing facts the way the Israelis are accused of doing very often. They're changing facts on the ground. And the rest of us are having to adjust our opinions, our views, and our policies in order to take account of that. What is going to be a problem for everybody is how do we end the war in a way that doesn't reward Putin, which in fact demonstrates that he's lost, even if he tried to persuade some of his population that he hasn't. How do we do that? And I think that requires real leadership on the part of everybody, and including the Ukrainians. But they will be the ones who determine what is acceptable and what is not, because we have no way of persuading them not to carry on fighting if they want to do so. So we have to find a way of ending the war. And secondly, we should want this war, and I'm not saying this is the overriding consideration, obviously ending it reasonably is more important, but we should want this war to change Russia, to persuade the Russians that they have no hope of living with their neighbors in peace unless they abandon the neo-imperial greater Russian mindset, which grips them at the moment. Attila and I have got a difference over what we see from Russia is nationalism. That's what he thinks. I think it's imperialism. And I think it's the last imperialism which we're going to have to fight in Europe with any luck.
Thank you very much. I suggest you continue this kind of debate upstairs with a cup of coffee and tea. So we have a short break now. Please come back at 4:40 for next panel, the debate of values in Europe. And I would like to have some applause for our